Can I begin our session, our plenary session now again with our keynote opening speaker, who is actually, believe it or not, a Dubliner in the United Nations. Aren't we proud? She's actually not really from Dublin. I discovered last night she's from Kildare, from Maynooth, but we'll qualify her as the Greater Dublin area. And it's Sally Fegan-Wyles, is the Assistant Secretary General, Director ad interim of UNITAR, which is the training agency of the United Nations. And Sally has more than 30 years of experience within the United Nations systems, holding various managerial positions in different UN entities, both in the field and at headquarters. And her most recent position was Senior Advisor on Systems-Wide Coherence in the Office of the Deputy Secretary General, where she led the interagency team that prepared the blueprint for the United Nations entity for gender equality and the empowerment of women. So Sally is an organization builder and changer, I think would be my summary there. Before joining the Office of the Deputy Secretary General, Sally was Director of the United Nations Development Group Office from 2001 to 2008, where she was responsible for guiding and supporting the UN reform efforts at the country level. And as Director of that organization, she led the efforts in providing policy support to UN country teams and the UN resident coordinators in 134 countries, and in implementing the ongoing UN reform plan, including the One UN approach being piloted in 8 countries. Despite all of that, that global involvement, she told me yesterday, this is only the second time in her working history that for work purposes she's got back to her home city. Sally.
Thank you very much, Peter. Good morning, everybody. As Peter said, I'm really delighted to be here today, not only to come to such an important opportunity for exchange of experience, but also because it's great to be home. I would like to congratulate Dublin City Council and UNDP for organizing this, which I think is the kind of event that we really need if we're going to really promote experience exchange and learn from each other. What I wanted to talk about this morning is the importance of effective partnerships for prosperous cities. The concept of prosperous cities has been recently introduced by UN Habitat in their 2012-2013 State of the World Cities report. And I found that very helpful when thinking about what I was going to say today. The report's not yet published, but it is available in draft on their website. The most important factors that Habitat found that impacted on the prosperity of a city, which they broadly defined to include the welfare of all of its citizens, including the most vulnerable, are, in order of importance, effective urban planning and management, decentralized policies and appropriate institutions, a system that creates equal opportunities for all, active participation for civil society, elected local officials, a favorable pro-business environment, access to basic amenities, and public transport and mobility. Well done to Dublin. Dublin comes joint number 3 with Copenhagen in the global ranking of major cities in terms of prosperity. They used 5 indicators to reflect the factors that I've just listed: productivity, quality of life, infrastructure, environment, and equity. And what I found very interesting is that the report looks at cities ranked with these 5 indicators, and Dublin comes out joint number 3, but it also ranks cities without the equity indicator. As you know, equity reflects the level of income inequality, as well as access to social services. Dublin scores very high on equity. So when this indicator is taken out, Dublin drops to number 7, as cities with higher levels of inequality, like London and New York, ascend in the ranking. With these factors, it's clear that the 3 sets of actors have a critical role to play in ensuring that cities are a good place to live for all of their citizens. That's local government, private sector, and communities. We take this for granted today, but the need for this tripartite partnership in the building of prosperous cities hasn't always been understood. and our ability to work effectively together in partnership, managing the very complex relationships that are involved. Despite the very different objectives and values, our ability to do this is still, I'm afraid, very limited. This is actually really hard to get right. While we try to work better together today, it's worth spending a minute to look back and see how the roles of these three actors have changed over the last 60 years and what we can learn from them. In the 50s and 60s, the state played the major role in defining development policies with a very top-down focus on community participation and an emphasis on investment in cooperatives. Of course, here in Ireland, the cooperative movement was really important in developing the state in the period after independence. In the 70s, the interest in participatory development waned, and the focus of policy shifted to large-scale state planning and investment in agriculture and industry. When I first started working in 1975, I was a volunteer working in Malawi. And the big investment vehicle was the Integrated Rural Development Program, where the state and external donors brought development to regions whether they like it or not. And I still remember sitting in the planning office with the other economists in Blantyre and religiously counting the numbers of people in a certain area according to the population statistics and working out whether there was enough population to justify a new school or a new clinic. Of course, there was no question of consultation. We did it all sitting in the office in Blantyre. By the mid-80s, these paternalistic, state-driven and completely unsustainable policies were being put to one side. We saw the role of government downplayed in favor of self-regulating markets, and we began to see the acceptance of the important role of private sector, replacing government as the engine of growth. It's hard for young folks here to remember, but in the early 80s, people working for government, and of course the UN is just many governments together, people working for government had no contact with the private sector. And when the idea of working with the private sector was introduced, there was huge suspicion and distrust. However, credit to the World Bank and USAID, they led the change in investment, and gradually the change in attitudes and thinking followed. This shift was fueled equally by the lack of sustainable success from state-led investment and by the high levels of inefficiency and corruption that were evident in some very young and some not so young democracies. Public-private partnerships, 3Ps, became the vehicle of choice for investment in cities, but also in other areas, allowing for the dynamic interaction between public and private sectors and leveraging the complementarity of the ethos of the public sector with the efficiency and innovation of the private sector. 3Ps have been successful when there has been clear agreement on the delivery of public service that would otherwise have been provided by traditional public sector investment. Through the early 2000s, the embrace of the role of private sector in driving development went a little too far. To quote a very influential paper by Professor Mark Moore from Kennedy School of Harvard in 2005, citizens living in nations throughout the world seem to have lost a great deal of confidence in their governments. They doubt whether governments can make good their frequent promises to provide jobs, increase material welfare, and provide a minimum level of health and education. In contrast, citizens seem to have increasing confidence in the private sector to improve conditions in their society and increasing belief in the power of markets to spur economic development without the bad social and political consequences of the past. This overenthusiasm continued well into the 2000s, despite early warnings by a number of UN agencies that these policies were increasing inequalities with negative impact on the poorest and the most vulnerable. And then we got to 2008, and we all know what happened, especially here in Ireland. The global economic crisis was a very unpleasant wake-up call that brought a halt to the uncontrolled wave of deregulation and marked the emergence of people power, with the Occupy Wall Street being just one of many examples, as well as the return of the state as a key actor in urban development. There is now wide acceptance of the need for a more comprehensive and holistic vision, moving away from the rather narrow mechanistic 3P approach towards the concept of public-private collaboration, or PPC, where the C stands for a broader concept of partnership or collaboration that includes all three types of actors. Successful PPCs should enable local governments and private sector to better respond to the needs of their communities through participatory decision-making, improved governance and accountability, and more efficient, inclusive, and innovative-based development responsive to the needs of the most vulnerable. When we talk of an enhanced role for city communities, we need to recognize the importance of the multiple roles that people in cities play, because it's all about the people. Of course, they are the individual actors who have an important contribution to make in the prosperity of their city. They are the intended beneficiaries of the services provided by the city, including the protection of the most vulnerable. They are the voters whose needs and preferences must be reflected in the decision-making process. They are the academics, which we've just heard, who can lead critical analysis and innovative thinking for better ways of doing things. And they are the media, who have a very critical role to play as watchdog, holding both state and private sector to account. But we have to be careful not to be overly romantic about community decision-making as we were with private sector. A very recent World Bank study, Localizing Development Does Participation Work, by Mansouri and Rao, highlights the weaknesses and challenges of participatory approaches. Community groups can be as corrupt or as subject to capture by economic, political, or ethnic elites as big business can be. When I worked in Zanzibar, the political and ethnic divisions were so strong at the local community level that we gave up even trying to seek community participation, as the mere contact with one group meant the automatic rejection by the other. It seems that balance is the key, which makes me feel awfully old to say this, but I'm not alone in this conclusion. All countries are now seeing a very active debate on getting the balance right, on recognizing the need for appropriate regulation from the state, innovation and efficiency from private sector, and the essential role of communities, not only the watchdog role, but also the essential community ownership. Which brings us back to the importance of managing the relationships between these three sets of actors. We can recognize that they're all essential for city prosperity, but do we do enough to understand and accommodate the differences in roles, motivations, and values of these three sets of actors? And do we have the mechanisms that we need to really work effectively in partnership? Each of these potential partners has distinctive assets, strengths, and weaknesses. They also have very different motivation, culture, and values. A major lesson from the EU experience in 3P is that we seriously underestimate these differences in objectives and needs, and we fail to recognize each other's strengths and weaknesses. Misunderstandings arising from these differences are very often the cause of failure of the partnership. Even when we speak the same language, language can be a major problem. I once sat through a major argument between two UN organizations where one understood the proposal to establish a new program meant setting up a new independent organization, while the other meant that they wanted to put a new program of activities into place, and they couldn't understand and got very upset at the defensive reaction to their idea. It took almost 3 hours before we realized that each had a completely different understanding of the words new program. Of course, it's the differences in strengths and assets that potentially add value to a partnership, in that when they're combined in the right way, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But the difficulty comes in combining them in the right way. There is no set formula. Every situation is different, depending on the issue being tackled, the city involved, the institutions, and even, and in some cases especially, the personalities. As Asa said yesterday, when faced with a challenge, it's human nature to ask, what can I do? But this is not the right question. We have to learn to ask, what needs to be done? Who is best placed to do this? And, most difficult of all, what can I do to help them do what they should do? This kind of partnership thinking does not come naturally. We have to proactively establish incentives for each of us and our staff to think and act in this way, so that we can build on our respective strengths and avoid our weaknesses. Establishing and supporting such partnerships is very challenging, and we need to do it better. In this session, I look forward to hearing about effective partnerships between local government, business, and civil society, how they overcome these challenges and work together to produce prosperous cities, and the important role that technology can help in bringing prosperity to cities. Finally, I have to say a few words about UNITAR, or else I'm going to have to fire myself when I get home. For the past 10 years, UNITAR has been working to help the three sets of actors essential to city prosperity to work better together. We do this by offering face-to-face training programs through a network of 10 centers, which is soon going to be 12, around the world, as well as through e-learning courses. The idea is to support local institutions to focus on key aspects of city development and to exchange experience with other cities, depending on the comparative advantage of each. This year, there will be 78 face-to-face training programs offered by the network, as well as between 5 and 9 online courses. UNITAR works in very close partnership with UNDP, for which we're very grateful, and we're very pleased to be able to open our training network to the WACAP members and to maintain a close partnership with WACAP going forwards. I will leave some documents wherever documents are left, so if anybody's interested, they can learn more about that. Thank you very much.